Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see. We welcome Roddy Doyle and Lorrie Moore to Live Talks Los Angeles. They'll discuss the writing life and Roddy's new collection of stories, Life Without Children. Roddy is the author of 11 acclaimed novels, including The Commitments, The Van, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize, Paddy Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, which won the Booker Prize, The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, A Star Called Henry, Smile, and most recently, Love. He has written several collections of stories, plays, and several works for children and young adults. Lorrie Moore is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. She is the recipient of the Irish Times International Prize for Literature, a Lannan Foundation Fellowship, as well as the PEN Malamud Award and the Rea Award for her achievement in short story. Everyman's Library published her collected stories in 2020. Towards the end, I will pose some questions sent in from you in the audience. Welcome to all attending, and take it from here, Lorrie.
Roddy, how are you doing? You're a tiny little square on my screen. I thought you were, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you?
I'm much better, having read your beautiful, wonderful, funny, heartbreaking collection of stories. It's just great book. And
thanks.
Of course, it's going to get a lot of attention because, for many reasons, but it is, so many of the stories are about the pandemic. Not all of them, but at what point when you were writing these stories did you realize you were going to have a collection that was really focused on COVID?
I think probably when I, like the rest of the Western world, realized that it wasn't going to be a matter of weeks, that we were in it for a long haul and a longer haul, and that time as we used to measure it seemed to, dissipate, seemed to be nibbled away. And I had started writing one of the short stories, the title story, Life Without Children, because I couldn't think of anything else to write. I'd been writing a novel. I'd only really started it. I hadn't written much. But when I sat, after the lockdown started and we got into the swing of things here in my house, I sat down to continue the novel and I realized it was utterly redundant. It was set in the present day, but that no longer existed. And I couldn't see a way back into it, and I didn't really want to. So I just thought of this story, or the guts of a story, because I'd actually been in the UK when Ireland went into lockdown, and there was no sign of any emergency in the UK. It was all a bit hysterical, really. And for the first time in my life, I felt far from home when I was in England. I mean, it's only about half an hour on a plane, and we speak the same language. And there are so many similarities between, say, Dublin and Newcastle, where I was. But I felt so far from home, and I just wanted to get home. So I was thinking about this, and I just thought, well, there might be a story in that. So I started writing the story that became Life Without Children. And then there were all sorts of estimates about when the lockdown would end. And I'm a season ticket holder with a soccer team here in Dublin. And it was announced that the season would resume in 6 weeks, maybe 7 weeks. And I was thinking, no, that's okay. But then I began to think of another short story. And as I wrote that one, I realized, well, this lockdown has gone on for months. And what I'm hearing here is this thing could go on for years. And the language was changing, the vocabulary was expanding and contracting. social distance was a thing we suddenly understood. We measured it. Droplets, the meaning of the word droplets changed. They were lethal things, droplets, whereas they used to be nice little, droplets keep falling on my head would still have been a hit. Probably raindrops is a better choice, but droplets would have done. It still would have been a massive hit in 1969 or 70.
Right.
But suddenly droplets were lethal, and even the way the word, when in the early days, people in Dublin referred to it as the corona. And that stopped after a while, and then it became the COVID, personified, the COVID. Mm-hmm. And so I was just interested in this. And I can't remember at what stage I wrote the story, Masks. But that must have been kind of well into the lockdown, because there were all sorts of debates here in Ireland as to whether masks were a good idea or a bad idea, whether they'd make us complacent or whether they even worked. And I remember there was one scientist stroke doctor on the TV news demonstrating how to put a mask on and saying that it was very important that you didn't touch it with your hands. And I think I'd rather just died and have to endure the torture of putting a mask on my face without using my digits. So the stories began to roll, and I tried to keep up with the different tones that went through. There was a giddiness in the first lockdown, and utter despair in the second one, and impatience and anger in the third one. I don't know how many lockdowns you've been through, Lorrie, but formally I've been through 3. And then all of a sudden, I mean, the biggest challenge, the last story is called The 5 Lamps. And it was the last one I wrote. And I started writing it almost literally a year after the first lockdown started. And it's set in the first days of the first lockdown. And it was really hard to get my head back to that 12 months earlier. Normally it's not a problem. Life is much the same. Normally life was much the same 12 months ago as it is today. There's not much that much difference. This time round, though, it was really, really hard to imagine myself back just 12 months before and trying to reimagine what the first days of the lockdown were like. It was an extraordinary year. So all the stories were written in that year. But the reason I wrote them is because I couldn't write anything else,
Right. You sit down at your desk and then the virus is infecting even your stories.
Yeah.
But in your case, in a good way.
Well, it's there, it's a bit like age. You may as well use the raw material that comes with it.
Right.
This thing arrived. I didn't want it. None of us wanted it, but you might as well use it,
Yes, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a feeling in the States you're not supposed to, that it's too soon. Oh. But I've written a story about COVID, but a friend of mine was trying to write a comedy about COVID which I thought was a very interesting idea. Mm-hmm. And her editor told her, no, don't do that. We can't publish it. We can't sell it. So good luck to you.
Well, I believe
I think
Gary Steingart's novel was rejected by his British publisher because they said it was too pandemic-y.
See, they have these weird little rules that make no sense and have no application to actual readers and writers.
And also, you reach an age where the term too soon
right.
is just rank arrogance, right. Really. To say, it's too soon. I'll do it in 10 years' time. No, you won't.
No,
you'll be a gibbering idiot in 10 years' time. You better do it now,
Say it's hard to remember what happened 12 months ago. In 5 Lamps, there's that great image of the smoothie that is disinfected. It's so, I was wondering whether that came from your recall or 12 months later when all the smoothie bottles, in fact, were being disinfected. But then he gives it to his son, who he's searching for in the empty streets. It's a beautiful story.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. No, I remember there were 4 of us in the house, 2 of my children and my wife and myself in the early days. And one of us would go down to the supermarket to get the dinner, the ingredients for the dinner. And it was a big deal, you get the stuff in and put it on the counter and wipe it down, and we'd all stand away. It was kind of a bit exciting, really, and a bit daft. And And it reached a ludicrous stage when my son we were all permitted to walk 2 kilometers once a day. And he used his walk to go to the local liquor store to get a bottle of vermouth, for one of the ingredients for what he was going to cook. My 30-year-old son with these, I thought, well, enough. But yeah, so I had to, we no longer wipe down things that we buy. But I had to remind myself that that's what you did. But I suppose the surprise is that it's a woman outside a methadone clinic, right, who does the wiping and gives this man the gift of the smoothie. It's not what you'd expect her to take out of her bag, and that's purely fictional. I liked the idea of this woman just making a kind gesture to him, right, that she sees. I mean, she must be struggling 24 hours a day herself, but she sees that he's struggling and decides to give him her mango. Mango's her favorite, her mango smoothie.
Right.
Yeah, haven't had one of those in years, actually.
They're very good, aren't they? They're very good. There is this sense throughout many of these stories of protagonists your age, my age, missing their children, seeking their children. There's a moment when the daughters come back to one character to be in the house for the pandemic, and he's so happy. But there is, preceding the stories about COVID and then continuing into those stories, there's this idea of middle age, facing mortality, and missing one's kids, and that was in your last novel as well, this kind of taking stock, missing the young family, the purposefulness of all that. And there's still this casting about in this book by the male protagonist mostly. And I wonder, I hate it when people ask questions like this, but I wonder if you'd speak to that.
Speak to what exactly? I can't see anything. I would. I'd be happy to.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think I thought about 15 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, that, I'd gone through that phase, that I felt redundant as a father because my kids were up and running and they were independent and they didn't really need me. And I must say, I'm at a stage now where my kids have gone, they're out of the house, they're living in Dublin. And I think one of my biggest fears, and I mean this with all affection, is that they'll come back. So I think my worry there is that I'll have run out of things to write about, because, but yeah, I think what being locked in and isolated did, it was that the little rhythms of the day, the saying hello to the postman, going for a pint once or twice a week, chatting to people on the street, little contacts, not even, big friendships, but little contacts when they were all stripped away, when they're, I quite deliberately have got an office now in the city centre to get me out of the house and get on the bus and go in. It's only 10 minutes on the bus, but and I've been working in the house here. I'm in the house at the moment in the attic in my office since 1993, and I've been always quite content working on my own. But I think it's the little contacts, the little face-to-face, eye-to-eye contacts that were gone, and it was really, really difficult. I mean, and I just thought, if this is the future, it's pretty grim. And I suppose, I'm using this material, aging, as you mentioned, the little humiliations of it all, the little comedies of it all, actually, as well. And I suppose when the busyness of our lives is put away for a while, that we're confronted with perhaps an emptiness, really. And I didn't personally feel it in any big way, and haven't done in a while because, as I said, my kids are gone and up and running. And it's so nice not to hear the refrigerator being opened and closed and opened and closed and opened and closed and opened and closed. And, I do miss the a picture of a boy standing in front of the refrigerator, fully expecting there to be something in it that wasn't there half an hour before, you know, that little expected miracle. I do miss that, but, you know, if I could orchestrate that just once a day, that would be nice. But other than that, I'm quite happy to see the back of them, really, you know. But I suppose when I was dredging, if you like, my head and my mind and my heart for things to write about, I never had a set plan for any of the stories, never do. That these things just cropped up in my mind, you know, that I suppose, you know, and as well, a lot of us, mortality literally was in the air, wasn't it, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And I've had to deal with, as we all do, we reach an age of grief quite regularly in recent years, and different forms of grief, you know, parental death, the death of my closest friend, which was a hard one, really, and still is to deal with, you know, a contemporary, somebody I fully expected to go through the rest of my life laughing with, you know, and sharing our love of music and football and stuff like that. And so then the pandemic arrives and the lockdown and all of this, and, you know, the images from Italy, particularly at the very beginning. And it was all pretty grim, you know. So I think you sit and you write, and this stuff, you know, and as you know, we use it, you know, we use it. And it may not be, sometimes, you know, that feeling. I'm thinking of a story, Charger, you know. I think this character's called Mick in The Charger, and he's close to devastation because his wife has gone for a medical checkup. She's gone off in a taxi, and he's fully convinced she won't be coming back. You know, she's gone out wearing a mask into the back of a taxi, and he realizes he's totally dependent on her. You know, unlike some of the other characters, he's totally dependent on her, you know, and he can't function and doesn't trust himself to function without her. Now, that's not me. You know, that wasn't me. That was me assembling the character, you know. Yeah,
I thought maybe it was you, and we could have a conversation about technology and fear of technology, because this Charger is in this water, and he's terrified. He's terrified he's going to be electrocuted. I thought, this is something that would totally happen to me.
Yeah, that was slightly autobiographical insofar as I did see the Charger beside my bed, and I thought it was in a bowl of water, and I was thinking, Jesus, how did that happen? Who put that there? And for a split second, somebody's trying to kill me, you know. But I realized, I looked around, it wasn't in the water at all. It's just, you know, a trick of the light. The bowl was white, so was the Charger wire, you know. So, but that happened a couple of years back, and I just, you know, it's like what we do. I don't necessarily take notes, but I think there is a filing cabinet in my head where these little things come out and are useful. I also remembered in that story, myself and my father going for a walk in the area I grew up in, which was suburban Dublin, but suddenly became the countryside. No longer. I mean, it's all built up. It's almost the inner city now. But coming to this field full of pylons that the electrical service had, you know, they were using these pylons wooden pylons for the new housing estates that were being built. And it was a magic moment. You know, I had siblings, but for whatever reason, it was just me and my father that day. Now, Mick's father died soon after. Mine didn't. He was 90 when he died, you know. So, but again, what will I do? What's the childhood memory, you know? And so I just gave Mick my memory, really, in that particular case, you know. So, like, I don't know what bird to use. Cuckoos, it doesn't seem fair. I don't know. We just pick these things up and use them, really, you know.
Yes, of course, the shiny things that are all stored there.
And of course, and not necessarily the shiny things either.
Well, the father says these are made of wood because wood doesn't conduct electricity, right? It's safe. Mm-hmm. That's probably something your father said, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My father, I don't know. I'd be a bit like yourself. I wouldn't be. I'm reasonably competent with a computer, but I've no idea why. You know, if I'm instructed to do something, I'll do it with a degree of competence, but I haven't a clue how it all works, you know. Yeah. My father did. I mean, he was a printer, but I mean, I'm just remembering the house I grew up in. You know, it was a house that him and my mother bought, but he added to it. And I can't but really, I took it for granted at the time when I'd see him out the back building a room onto the side of the room, you know, or putting electrical wires through the kitchen. He didn't seem to need a plumber or an electrician or any of these people. He just seemed to be able to do it himself, and it all seemed to be self-taught or whatever. And I've been told I can't change a plug. No, that's an absolute lie. I can. I haven't had to in a long time, but I can. But there are other things I'm just not able to do. But I wondered with Mick, obviously the death of a father when you're young is a big, big loss. And I wondered then how big, how huge a loss it was for Mick, not just the loss of the father, but the loss of conversation about the father. He stopped being, totally. There was no talk about him. And that came really, it's a huge thing in my life, because it was a huge thing in my mother's life. Her mother died when she was 3 and nobody spoke about her. She knew nothing about her, almost literally nothing about her. Didn't know her name, where she came from. Gradually then in her 50s, assembled information about her mother. And I was an adult at this stage and was able to witness it happening. So it was quite extraordinary, really. So that absence of the parent has been, even though my parents lived into, I was nearly 60 when my mother died. So it wasn't my experience, but I think I lived in a way by observing my mother, discovering her own mother. It had a huge impact on me, I think. And I thought, well, the absence of Mick's father and nothing really relying on his own childhood memories and nothing else to keep hold of his father runs right through that story, I think.
Right. A lot of buried trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Too. Yeah. I know your mother died the same year my mother did. Did your father live to see the beginning of the pandemic?
No, neither of them did.
Neither of them did, right.
My father, I imagine myself and my siblings were imagining our parents in the pandemic, and my father would have sat in his chair. He would have sat in his chair and he'd have been giving out, but he'd have been content enough. My mother would have been driven demented because she would want to get out. Right. She loved going out. And she went into the city centre twice a week, right up to quite soon before she died at 92. And she would have been driven demented and would have driven us demented as well, trying to basically, I suppose, nail her down to try and keep her in the house and safe. She'd have taken the risk, I think, rather than be confined in the house. So, but neither of them saw the pandemic, no.
And you end up feeling very grateful for, my father.
In a strange, I was grateful my children were adults, and I was grateful my parents went around for it, And I didn't feel guilty about that because, today my father would be 98 or something like that, so, personally, I don't want to tempt fate, but I really don't want to be around when I'm 98.
No. Well, that's not, well, at any rate. You brought up the story Masks. I love that. I love all these stories, but that story is particularly weird.
Yeah.
And sort of a horror story
that
suddenly twists into a comedy at the end. Yeah. Well, suddenly there's laughter and cheers, but it's a guy who's just had enough, and he's walking, and he's got all this aversion to these disgusting masks that are littered all around on the ground, and he's going through, I think, a park path or something, and then he starts to lift them up and put them on, and suddenly he's sort of covered with them. And people who see him, instead of being horrified, they say bravo, or they cheer him.
Yeah, because he's
a beautiful,
he's art.
He's art. He's become art, right? It's a piece of performance art.
Yeah. Well, again, I started this story not knowing where it was going. I'm lucky in that I live very close to the sea. The bottom of my road, Dublin Bay, is there for me. And there's a promenade that stretches quite a distance. I can walk it for a good hour before, in fact, more. I could walk quite a distance and back. And I did the same walk really every day have a couple of dogs, and I'd bring the dogs with me. And I wouldn't do it every day at the same time, but funnily enough, there were people I'd see every time I went. And there were people on the road I'd see walking constantly, you know. And I thought one a day was fine by me, you know, that'll keep me exercised. But it seemed to be, and they were getting delivery then. It was no longer possible just to go for a walk. You had to have walking gear, you know. And so they were wearing, I'm not sure whether it's Lycra, but Lycra type gear all of a sudden. And, it was no longer walking, it was trekking and hiking. You know, it's flat, you know, down there. There's no challenge. Getting from A to B is the challenge. There's nothing to overcome or climb over. There's no, you know, walls to scale, barbed wire to beat or anything like that. And yet, so I'd see the same people no matter what time of the day it was. And I suppose there were one or two faces that looked, from a writerly point of view, interesting, you know, from a human point of view, worrying, I suppose. You know, you'd even imagine you were seeing people losing weight as they got closer to you. They were walking so much, a desperation about it all, maybe an anger about it all. And I just imagined one man who, it's his job and is going to his job and doing the job and coming home and getting ready to go off the following day. This is the frame of his life. And once he's told he has to stay at home, there's nothing, you know. He lives in, I'd imagine he lives in the childhood home. Both parents are gone. He's never been in a real relationship, I think. He's totally alone, and he's only really actively aware of the fact that he's alone now, because there's nothing to distract him. And on the walk out, away from home along the coast, he's angry. All these the things that he sees, the man in the shelter singing the aria, that was a daily thing I would see, you know, and hear. School kids, when the schools opened again, you know, singing Taylor Swift songs. And, you know, now and again you'd hear that. The young man with the uilleann pipes, you know, the Irish version of the bagpipes, he was there a lot of days as well. Busking in a way, I thought, because he loved playing, not because he was hoping to make much money, because nobody had money at that stage, if you know what I mean. Nobody had cash. Nobody was carrying coins or notes in their pockets, and he didn't have, as far as I could see, a credit card machine, you know. So he was just playing for the love of it. But my character, just any intrusion, anything that seems a bit joyful, because it's not coming from him and he's incapable of producing it, makes him angry. And then, I don't know if you remember, when the masks became mandatory or whatever, suddenly they became litter.
Yes.
You know, which really stunned me at first, because I thought they were a bit precious, really, very personal in a way. The difference between life and death, perhaps. And yet they were just being discarded, thrown on the ground. And
they were
quite shocking.
And they were a biohazard.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, he remembers a time when he could envisage a different future for himself, where he used to perform in front of his family down in the country in his mother's family farmhouse, standing on a table that his father had put him up on to sing before his voice broke. And he'd have a rapt audience, all family in the farm kitchen. And he imagined his mother's face. I don't think mothers escape very well from my collection of stories. There's a lot of dodgy mothers in the stories, there seem to be. But anyway, his mother's face tells him, "You're a great lad, don't ever do that again." You know, she doesn't want him losing the run of himself. Right. And he never does. He never loses the run of himself. So for whatever reason, this time he does. He picks up a mask, puts it on, picks up another one, puts it on. I could imagine, because I'm a glasses wearer and have been, and putting on the masks over the glasses, I could imagine, you know, sometimes you get a new pair of glasses and they never fit. And the relief of taking them off is so overwhelming. You know, they're either too tight or they're digging into an ear. And I imagined him inviting this discomfort, really. And I imagined also that, in a way, because they were damp or whatever, they could feel quite nice on the skin, you know. But then I pictured him that eventually he's going to look a bit like the Elephant Man, really. Yeah. And then he starts singing. you know. And at that point, I kind of lost touch with him and began to imagine myself seeing it instead.
Yeah.
You know,
and
whether it's a once-off or whether he decides this is going to be his daily, if he survives, because
if he survives,
he's really dicing with death for his art. With that one,
he's dying for his art. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a big. How about the there's a story early on. It's not a pandemic story, but it's a story. I think I originally read it in an airport and emailed you about it because I burst into tears at the end. But it's about the guy who wants to. He's walking along the beach again, walking along the sea. He wants to go see that dead whale. And
yes.
And he's got his kid in the sack in the carrier, and he's decided the poor child has died.
Yeah.
But he's going to keep walking to go see the whale.
Yeah.
And he's remembering this later when he's older, and of course, and then he says, "Oh, you'll have to forgive me if I try to find this part." He says he'd never told anyone that he thought she was dead. That he'd carried her dead for 20 minutes. She was in Vancouver now. She'd be Skyping him later.
Yeah.
He hadn't thought of it in years, the day on the beach. But that's a story. It's a pre-pandemic story, and yet it kind of leads to the mood of all the pandemic stories.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of stories I'd written some years ago. That was one of them that seemed to fit that feeling of being locked down or enclosed, or somehow, it seems a too dramatic a word, but it just sprang to mind, finished in a way. Yeah. Children are reared. What'll I do today?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I do that. My eldest son was born in 1991, and we went to Kerry that summer, and we're told in the local pub, "Oh, there's a dead whale up the beach." So the following morning, it was a bit, Kerry being on the west coast of the west coast of Ireland, there's no guarantee it won't be raining the following morning, but it wasn't anyway. So I put him into the carrier, whatever it was called, put it on my back, and went walking along the beach to see the whale. And I could see it in the distance, but basically you could smell the thing before I saw it. And walking along the beach, he was chirping away at one point, and then it stopped. And I knew, because the way, I don't know, when kids are infants, we're constantly checking them, and we're totally irrational in ways, terrified in some ways, and I just thought, not for 20 minutes by any means, but because he was totally still, I was thinking, Christ, is he okay? And I took the thing off and had a look to see that he was okay. And he was fine. He was grand. He'd just fallen asleep, and, as children do, and babies do anyway. But again, I put it away. And it came out of the filing cabinet maybe 25 years later. That feeling, that glimpsed feeling, geez, the baby's dead. It's a horrible thing to even say out loud.
No.
No. But we all have those moments where we think it. And so I was able to, again, to use it. And a lot of these memories we have of childhood, of our children's early lives, I mean, the things we remember are quite strange at times. The little things that we recall that have no significance in their lives, and possibly not an awful lot of big significance in our lives, but they're the things that seem to stick.
And you don't know what you're going to later on.
No, you can't pick and choose, really.
No.
Even if you take notes, which I never do, if you take notes, I don't keep a diary. I've never kept a diary. I always feel too self-conscious when I start writing a diary. And besides, I write all day, so the last thing I want to do,
yeah, that's right.
I want to watch TV. I want to watch, Succession or football. I don't want to write a bloody diary. So so these things just pop up into the head again. Yeah. I'd no idea when I started the story where I was going with it, and these things just arrive. The same with the story Life Without Children. He recalls a time when at his father's funeral, another man coming up to him and shaking his hand and saying, I'll just say one thing, you're not half the man your father was. That was said to me at my father's funeral, And I didn't put it in the story as an act of revenge, because I'm pretty certain the guy who said it will never read the story. It was very, very hurtful, as you can imagine. Really hurtful.
Why did he say that?
He didn't. I think ultimately he doesn't approve of me.
Because you're a writer? Because
I'm a writer. And because I write things that he probably doesn't approve of, and use language that he doesn't approve of. And I'm only surmising. I don't really know, and I don't really care. But I didn't intend including it in the story the day I sat down to write that piece of the story, but it just made sense to put it there.
Right.
It just made sense. It wasn't a way to fill half a page. It just made dramatic sense, I suppose, or narrative sense, Right.
Your stories are propelled by dialogue. I mean, you're writing from the beginning, from your first book on, is very interested in how people talk with each other, and it records it so well. And you have a great ear. I'm wondering if your ear out in the world is different than the ear at the desk. But you hear people talking. I don't know if you want to. I don't know anyone's work that is so has so much great dialogue and uses dialogue to move the narrative along.
Well, thank you.
Not just you do.
That was one of the challenges of stories set during the lockdown, is finding people to talk to. That's in many ways why there were little glimpses of their pasts, because they could get another 2 or 3 into the story. It was really, at times, it was a challenge, trying to find. But I'm not aware when I'm wandering around, and I do wander around a lot. I certainly don't eavesdrop, I don't actively eavesdrop. And my hearing isn't as good as it used to be either. But I'll give you an example. And it may never appear in the story, or it may, but it was a wonderful thing. It was just great. In Dublin, and I think possibly the rest of Ireland, but certainly in Dublin, there's a tradition that when you're getting off the bus, the door is close to the driver's compartment. And when you're trooping, as say you're getting off at the last stop in the city centre, and there's about 20 people trooping off the bus, the tradition is you thank the driver. It's gone on for all my life. You just go past the driver, say, thanks very much, thanks, thank you very much, thank you. And I've noticed that people who have arrived in the country, say from Eastern Europe or Africa, do the exact same thing. They see that people are doing it, and they thank the driver. So last week, I'm not sure what day, it doesn't matter. I was getting off the bus, Talbot Street, the terminus, and there were a couple of people in front of me, and it was, thank you, thanks very much, thank you. And I said, thanks. And I was getting off the bus, and the young man behind me, I didn't see him at first, but the young man beside, he just said, driver, that was absolutely flawless. It was brilliant. The driver burst out laughing. I burst out laughing. Funny. The young lad, he was in his 20s. He didn't laugh. He just got off the bus and strode on to conquer the world, And it was just, it's a bit sentimental, but to an extent I was thinking, only in Dublin, you'd only get that in Dublin. Excuse me. I may never use that quote, but I'll certainly use that attitude.
Right.
What came with it. And I was glad I was there to hear it, because in a way, well, you could make that up, or I could make that up, but there's so much more. Having heard it, it offers the opportunity to do so much more, So I think I'm fed by the way people speak. I visited 2 high school classes there recently for the first time in a long, long time, 15 and 16-year-olds. And it was great they were asking me questions, but it was great just to hear the way they were expressing themselves. It was just brilliant. And I don't know if I heard a phrase that I'll take away and use, but I'm sure there was 1 or 2 things that I heard that I now feel that bit more confident that if I have a 15 or 16-year-old character, the ice will be a bit let thin than it normally is, sometimes. There hasn't been a 15-year-old in the house, and 8 or 9 years, so listening to conversation, not actively listening, but being around the buzz. One of the almost disturbing things about Dublin in January and February, early February, was just how deserted the place was, and how little you heard. I sit in a cafe having a cup of coffee in the middle of the morning, and I might be the only person there. And this is in the middle of a city of 1.5 million people, a big European city, if you like. But there's nobody in it, but it's beginning to fill up again, and so it's great to hear the voices again.
And are people wearing masks? What is Dublin?
Not on the street, no. You wear the mask going into a cafe or a pub or a store, a shop, but not on the street. No, very few people are wearing masks in the street.
People take their masks off in the pub. They actually go to pubs again.
I was in a pub with 2 of my children last week. Met them after work in the evening time. It was the first time I'd been in a pub when the restrictions had been lifted, and I wore the mask in. I don't know about yourself, Lorrie, but I've never captured a way of doing it where they don't steam up when you walk into a warm room.
Yeah, the glasses fog up. It's terrible. You have to pinch
so
really tight.
I struggled in the direction of the bar. I wasn't quite sure whether, I knew the bar before, but it'd been a long time since I was in it. So the muscle memory wasn't all that reliable. Normally I'd know 4 strides and I'm there, but I wasn't sure. So I lifted the glasses off me, but I was wearing the glass. I wasn't sure whether you wore the mask and took it off when you got to the bar, and then you buy your pint, and then you look for somewhere to go, a wall to lean against or something, and you put the mask back on till you got there. But I noticed that people were putting the masks on, or most people were putting the masks on when they were going to the ladies or the gents, Yeah. Other than that, you just take it off and you sit down, or as in my case, I was just leaning against a wall, and I took it actually. Trying to drink a pint of Guinness wearing a mask is just not worth the effort. Or the laundry bill.
No. Well, I haven't been in a pub or a restaurant in 2 years.
All right.
It's really kind of sad. I've eaten outside and been on porches and things, but I haven't been inside.
No, eating outside at the moment, there's a storm brewing outside. Eating outside really isn't an option,
Yeah.
So going in and the distance restrictions have been lifted, so that's great, So bit of a shock going into a full pub, actually. Bit of a shock,
Do you become sort of phobic about people a little bit and their aerosols and their droplets?
No, not quite. Not now, but I'm kind of a bit judgmental. What are they doing here? And I think the exact same thing I'm doing here. Yeah, but this is my place.
Yeah.
They've no right to be here. So I've been to football games now. Granted, we're outside, and I'm going to one now. The season starts here in a couple of weeks, and I'll be going to a game, and it'll be full. The stadium will be full. And but again, it's outside, so it's not quite the same. But I'm really looking forward to that, actually, to be in the company of thousands of people all shouting at the same time. It'll be great. So, but it does get, it's like learning, do you know the way they say, once you learn how to cycle a bike, you never forget.
Right.
That might be literally true, but getting up on a bike after about 20 years not being on a bike, you can still stay on the bike, but you do have to learn an awful lot very quickly.
Right.
Or relearn an awful lot very quickly.
Right.
And I think it's the same with going back into what hopefully is some sort of normality, relearning how to walk into a crowded room,
I don't think I could ever do it again, actually.
Do you reckon?
Without a mask.
Yeah. Come to Dublin, I'll show you how. It's not too hard.
Okay. I'm teaching in a mask, which is, it's really hard to teach in a mask. And also you can't read anybody's faces, which is, which is a handicap for teaching. And it's a handicap for writing too, because you can't see a smile. So you sort of have to practice smiling with your eyes.
Yeah. Well,
it's like, or studying people's eyes to see if they might be smiling. And I've completely misread people. over and over again, thinking
Right.
everything was fine, but au contraire,
Oh, God.
because the mask was hiding something else I didn't see. So,
All right.
oh well. So, do we have to go to the questions? No, I don't think so. I haven't gotten a sign yet. So we'll just wait. Are you also thinking, because you also write for the screen and you write for the stage and you write children's books, and are you taking your thoughts about the pandemic and lockdown and all of that into any of those directions? Or
yes and no. Yeah. You know, when it comes to the screen and the stage and and TV and movies, I mean, ultimately it won't be my decision. It'll be other people's decisions as to whether the thing is worth financing, you know. But yeah, there's a story I've been working on, not recently, which may be a sign that it's not going to happen, but a story about a group of people who meet up after the restrictions have been lifted, you know, and somehow or other they want to celebrate lives that are lost, you know, including their own in a way, their youth or whatever. But whether it happens or not is another thing. And if it's a film, it's a film, but it won't. I'm not tempted to convert it into a book or anything. At the moment, I'm working with a boxer, writing her story. She's a wonderful woman from the inner city of Dublin. Her name is Kelly Harrington, and she won a gold medal in Tokyo. And so I'm writing her story with her, which is just nothing to do with the pandemic, although she broke her thumb just before the European qualifiers, and at least the European qualifiers for the Olympics. And she didn't think she was going to be able to go. And the thumb had recovered in time for a second, you know, go at the qualifiers, but they were cancelled the day before she was to box. And she didn't really think she was ready. So the whole thing is, you know, the 2020 Olympics took place in 2021. And because she'd had the time to recover and to go back into the qualification, she ended up winning the gold. So in a way, in some ways, it is a pandemic story, because she wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have met her. We wouldn't be telling her story if the pandemic hadn't arrived to kind of give her thumb time to recover. But that's what I'm doing at the moment. And it's really, it is literally a full-time job. I mean, it's 7 days a week. We delivered half the book a few weeks ago. We've to deliver the other half on the 1st of April. So it's tough going, but it's great. It's a bit of an adventure, really, you know, because I know nothing about boxing, really. And I decided not to look at any of her fights and to rely on her words to describe each fight that she went through, and, you know, how she ended up fighting in the first place and trying to find a club that would take her as a 16-year-old girl. And yeah, it's great. It's great.
So is this for television or for the screen?
No, it'll be a book. It'll be, you know, largely for an Irish readership, but it'll be a book. Yeah.
A book.
Yeah.
So it's okay. So
it's her story, really.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So what I'm doing is assembling it. I think in the contract, she's referred to as the author and I'm referred to as the writer.
Right. You're kind of.
And I think that captures it, you know.
And do you have a title?
No, not yet. No. Her name is Kelly, Kellie, so it may well be something like that. And again, Ireland being Ireland's small country, when you say Kelly these days, everybody knows who you're talking about.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So yeah, so it may well be just that. I don't know. We haven't come up with the title yet, but
women
that's
boxing,
great.
That was something we never thought we'd see when we were children, right? Or did you see it?
Or even adults. I mean, I took down Joyce Carol Oates' book on boxing.
Yes.
When Kelly, this boxer, got in touch with me and asked me would I be interested in doing the book, which I thought was great. And before I met her, I just found Joyce Carol Oates' book and I took it down and was reading it. So there's a woman who loves boxing. And I think the book was written or published about 30 years ago. But I think the word woman appears maybe once. You know, There was an assumption that women didn't box.
Yeah.
So it is interesting because, you know, there are passages, I could send them to you later, you know, and passages And but for the fact it's her and she, you'd never think, people of our generation, you'd never think this is a woman, this is a girl. And yet the country is full of these young women. And she found a network of women that, to spar with. She spent most of her weekends going from club to club to club, as she said, just looking for a scrap to get into the rig and just knock the brains out of each other, really. And she loved it. She loved it. And the discipline went from being, just loving a scrap to becoming a boxer and learning the whole, the technique of it and the discipline of it. And she's so good at describing it. It's great. She uses a mix of a street language and then technical language, and it really works. Listening to her anyway, it's just it's quite a joyful experience because she loves it.
I have to say, I've seen exercise venues where they have the boxing bags hanging from the ceiling, and most of the people in there are women. But I don't think of that as boxing. I just think of that as getting it out of your system.
Yeah, she calls it going to war with the bag.
Going to war with the bag. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So I think we have questions now.
Right.
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Lorrie.
Okay.
First question says, you write novels, plays, short stories. When you have an idea brewing for a story, what determines if you're thinking it's a short story, a novel, or a play? And the follow-up to that is, does it ever start out as one and evolve into another?
Let's start with the last bit. The only one I can recall is that I had an idea for a movie, and it was very visual at first. A chip pan, where you put French fries into, seen from above, and it's bubbling away, and it becomes a sink of water, and a man is washing his face. And for a split second, you think that he's immersing his hands in the fat. And I saw it as a movie about two men who buy a fish and chip van and go on the road. And actually, very quickly, it became a novel. I don't remember why. It was 1990, I think, or 1989 when I came up with the idea. And I'm not sure why I abandoned the idea of the film and it became a novel. I'm glad it did, actually. And eventually it became a film as well. But usually when it comes to a short story, it's usually a moment. It's just a moment in somebody's life. And often I deliberately put on the blinkers and don't look left or right or back or forwards. I'm just interested in them then at that moment. And it strikes me there's a novel here. And when I was writing the 10 books, the 10 stories that are in the new collection, I don't think there was ever a point where I thought, even though one or two of them are quite long, I don't think there was ever a point where I thought, do you know what, this might be a novel. I don't think so. I think they were always going to be short stories. The other things, with plays, I'm not sure if I've ever written a play just for the heck of it. I think all the plays I've written that have been produced here in Dublin, I've been asked to, or invited to, or it's been suggested. And I think if I sat here for the rest of my life, I'd never think of writing a play. I'd be writing stories and novels, mostly novels, I suspect. The others generally involve people getting in touch and saying, would you be interested in doing this? And often I am, because I'm quite good with time. I use my time quite well. It's not that I'm disciplined. I think we're all disciplined. It's that I'm able to apportion time quite well. And if I spend, an hour working on something, I can get quite a lot done. Shut that down and open something else, have a break and go back and do this thing. And so I'm quite good at, I suppose if it's a cooker having 4 things on the hob, that eventually will become one thing with a bit of luck. So, I'm reasonably good at that. But, the thing, when I'm finished this book about the boxer, I started a novel and I want to get back into it. And if somebody said you will spend the rest of your life writing this novel, I'd be quite content to be in that land,
Next question. This is LA after all, and there's always film-related questions. How involved do you get in the adaptation of your books into film?
As involved as I need to be, really, at heart. I write the script and that's it. I had the experience, say, most recently in 2018. I wrote the script, chatted a lot with the director, met one or two of the actors, wasn't asked my opinion whether I thought they were right or not. Thought that's okay. I wouldn't want to be in some stuff. Visited the set a couple of times just to say I was there, and it was all made on location, and all the places were very close to where I lived, so there was no great jaunt there. And yet I didn't have much of a role. The only role I had was towards the end, where I was asked to look at a rough cut, and there were one or two scenes the editor and the director were wondering about whether they should end a bit sooner, or whether I can't remember what they were. There were 4 or 5 key issues they wanted to have a chat about, and I think that's my role after I've written the script. Really, is to be there if I'm wanted. But I've no great. I never had the wish. I knew that I wouldn't be a director. I don't have that type of energy, and I don't have the eye. So it was never an ambition. So I was always quite content just to do the right. With 2 of the films, The Snapper and The Van, they were directed by Stephen Frears, and I spent a lot of time on the set there because he wanted someone to talk to, I think, as much as anything else. And I was quite content to spend all day talking to Stephen Frears because he's great company. And, we could pretend we were doing something useful, and he was, but I was just drinking coffee and chatting to him and enjoying myself. So there are limits. When I've got and I hope later in the year to have a play staged in Dublin here. And I'll be there for the first few days of rehearsals and I'll answer the actors' questions. But then the best thing for me to do, I know from experience, is just to go away and to come back when the director wants me to see what they've been doing. That's the best thing for me to do. Not to be haunting the place and, putting on worried expressions or wanting to be everybody's best friend. That's another real daft thing to want to do, So I think I'm quite content being the writer.
Another question here. It says you posted snippets of dialogue on Facebook, or you have, related to current events, and some of this worked its way into a book. Writing is typically a solitary endeavor, but this made it somewhat public. Did you do that intentionally, or did it just happen that way? And then the follow-up is, what are your thoughts about social media and its impact on you as a writer?
Well, everything I've written has been intentional. I joined Facebook, can't remember when. Really, I needed it. I needed a little bit of knowledge about Facebook first because of something I was writing, and the character I was trying to describe had to be a bit savvy about social media, and I wasn't. So I opened a Facebook account, and the good part of it was that a lot of young people, well, they were no longer young, but people I used to teach when I was a high school teacher, almost immediately got in touch. And that was really nice, really, really nice. Hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them. And then there was a time when, within the space of 2 weeks, Barack Obama visited Ireland, and the Queen of England also visited Ireland. And that doesn't happen very often. So I imagined 2 men at the bar talking about this, and I decided not to give them names, not to do anything except a dialogue, and to limit it, I don't know why, to 200 words. And I put it up on Facebook, and the response was great. So I started doing it quite regularly. And I did it for years. And I wrote a play based on it, which hopefully, again, it was supposed to tour in 2020. It had toured already, and it was supposed to tour again in 2020, but it was cancelled. And we're hoping now to see it next year. But the play was quite simple, just 2 men at a bar talking, And I don't do it anymore for the simple reason that it kind of ran out of steam. And I was getting requests, will you do one about, some musician would die? And, there was a spate of them I did that David Bowie and Prince and all these people seemed to be queuing up to die. It was quite weird at one point. But I stopped it then. And then somebody hijacked my Facebook account. Somebody in Vietnam currently has my Facebook account. I wrote to the nice people in Facebook, and I never got a response really. So the guy in Vietnam's welcome to my Facebook account. I haven't had it for about 3 months, and to be honest with you, I don't miss it. And I'm told by people who, are on Facebook that he hasn't done anything with it. And he's made no contact with me, and I don't know what the value of it is to him. And so for the time being, anyway, until my pal in Vietnam decides to give me my Facebook account back, I won't be doing any more of the dialogues. And other than that, I have no knowledge of social media, and I really don't. I think I've been told, you should go on Twitter. It's really quite interesting, but I would find it too distracting. I find Wordle and the spelling bee in the New York Times as much distraction as I can cope with in any one day.
What motivated you to write for children?
My own. Simple as that. I was telling stories to my children. They were 7 and 5 and a new baby. And it took off from there, really. I realized I used to make up stories for them at bedtime, and they enjoyed them, but I didn't really. The writer in me thinking, oh, these aren't good enough. So I started to write down a few pages every day, and it gradually became a book called The Giggler Treatment, which was the first one. And it took it from there. And I stopped then writing for children. I think I wrote one book for children after my children had stopped being children, so to speak. And while I enjoyed writing it, I had to push myself to finish it, really, in a way that often I don't feel. And I felt, well, that's it, really. I don't think I'll be writing children's books again. One of my books, Greyhound of a Girl, I wrote it for a young girl. And I realized as I was finishing it that particular young girl, my daughter, was no longer that girl, and that she'd grown significantly. And I binned it and started again and wrote it for an older girl. And I think I just about got there on time. And it now has been adapted for a cartoon or an animation feature by an Italian director. And hopefully I'll be seeing it later this year, which is very exciting.
What is your typical writing day like?
It used to be get the kids off to school, and I'd come upstairs to the office at about 9 o'clock, and basically I'd stay here all day. Now I'm less rigid, if you like. I have an office in town, so I go down, and I don't have predetermined days that I'll go in or whatever. It's not weather dependent. I don't look out the window and say I'll stay home today, but it's often, what am I doing today, dependent. And so I'll go into town, work a bit, wander around a bit. The Monday to Friday thing doesn't really mean anything anymore. So I might work on Saturday, but I won't work on Tuesday. Also, members of the family, if they're not working, I might not work either. And, so I'm more flexible, I suppose, with my time than I used to be. So I now measure work in hours, really, rather than the day. So I can get, as I said before, I'm working on this project, for example, with Kelly Harrington, the boxer. I was working on it today, and by just listening to her voice and transcribing it, and as I go along, changing it, for about 3 hours, I got the guts of a chapter done, because she was talking about boxing matches she was fighting to get to a final. So there was very little fat on it, so to speak. It was all action, 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 and brilliantly described by herself. I was exhausted listening to her, let alone. She, sometimes when you're looking at football or boxing or anything, any physical activity on the TV, that exertion doesn't really come across very often. It all looks so effortless very often, but when she describes it, it's not. But I felt I got a good day's work in there, even though it wasn't anybody's measure of a good day's work, conventionally speaking. So I didn't do an awful lot today, but I did.
We have two more questions. One here is, when you've written trilogies, do you set out to tell your story in 3 books, or is that necessitated by how big the story ends being?
It's just accident, really. I wrote 3 novels that became known as the Barrytown Trilogy. It wasn't my idea. I kind of pushed against the idea for a long, long time, but it was pointless because people kept referring it to as the Barrytown Trilogy, the Commitments, the Snapper, and the Van. And then they were published in one edition at one point, and I wasn't going to say, no, you can't do that, because it was brilliant, you know. But it wasn't. I never saw it as a trilogy, and still don't. It just happened to be 3 novels, you know. And another trilogy I wrote, I finished the first one and I realized I want to take this further. And then when I was writing the second one, I realized this is the middle bit. I want to take it further again, you know. So it ended up being another trilogy, but I never had it in mind at first, you know. If it had been 4 books, I wouldn't have minded. But maybe it's the, you know, I'm an atheist, but I was hauled through Catholic school, so maybe I can't get away from the Divine Trinity, really, you know. But it may well be just beginning, middle, and end. And I think that might have been there before Christianity.
And our final question comes from a lady who says, there is something about the Irish and storytelling. Any thoughts on that? Where does that come from?
I'm not sure where the storytelling tradition comes from, but I think the reason there's so much energy in the stories, I think, is in a way historical, because 200 years ago, the vast majority of us, and by us I mean Irish people, in a conventional sense, if you like, those who might be descendants of people who were around 200 years ago, our descendants were sitting around speaking Irish, speaking Gaelic. And within 100 years, that had stopped. And it was an enormous, chaotic, traumatic century where the population in the space of 50 years, went from 8 million to 2 million. Now, historians might dispute my figures there, but I'm trying to get across the point that rough times in the second half of the 19th century, and in a way, without any decision being made, the people of Ireland seemed to, almost to a man and a woman, have decided to give up on the Irish language because it was killing them. Not the language, but their position as living on a colony. So for various reasons, it was abandoned. But the Irish has always been bubbling under the English. And we speak Irish in a way, if you stay and listen, we speak Irish in a way that is kind of unique to the island, and it's richer because of that, because of the way we use phrases. I'm after getting into trouble. It sounds a bit like Diddley or Paddy, like a line from the Quiet Man, but actually you'll hear it every day, that phrase, I'm after doing this, I'm after doing that, because it's a direct quote, a literal quote of an Irish phrase. And it became an English phrase. And I think the reason why I think there's so much energy in Irish storytelling is because we had the English language inflicted on us, and we took it and made it our own. And it was the only thing we owned at one point. By we, I suppose I'm being a bit sentimental there. And it's also, you can see its energy now in the language of the English being written, because I'm involved in a creative writing centre for young people. And a lot of the best writing is coming from young people who are listening to Polish in their houses, or African French in their houses, or listening to languages other than English in their houses, and are adding to their own English. And because they're surrounded by people who talk a lot in this country, silence isn't an option. People have often remarked on that people who strangers talk to each other. And I think it's because, really, at heart, it was a little act of sedition almost, taking that language and making it our own, and telling stories with it, really. And the oral tradition goes back definitely thousands of years. But you could say that about any culture, you know. So we don't own that, but I do think we own our own particular way of telling a story. And if you grow up in it, you know, the Irish tend to, if you hear a joke, the next time you hear it, it'll be a story, something that actually happened to somebody, no matter how absurd it is, or the storyline. The punchline is the point, but really it might take days to get to it, because it's become a story in a location with people called Mick and Paddy and, Ivan and, Adnan and all the names that have been added into the bucket of available names in Ireland. And it immediately, becomes something that happened, So I think that's what I grew up with anyway. And what's amazing, really, I find is that, the whole, it's impossible to keep up with the amount of work that's being published by young, particularly women, but women and men in Ireland at the moment. And I find it extraordinary that women and men in their 20s and 30s want to keep writing books and stories, that they're not all keen to, do the other stuff that's available. They just want to write old-fashioned books and old-fashioned stories. It's brilliant.
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you, Lorrie. And thanks to those of you who sent in questions. Again, Roddy Doyle's new book is Life Without Children, and it is available wherever books are sold. Thanks, and as we like to say around here, please go on gently.